Section 1 of Weird Tales presents Women of Weird Fiction Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Weird Tales presents Women of Weird Fiction Volume 1. The Tomb Dweller by Alice I. Fuller. Prowling about in graveyards may not be an exhilarating pastime for the average person, but it has always been my favorite diversion. My earliest recollection is of the insatiable craving for grim and ghostly things that has dominated my life. While other youths of my age were engaged in sports or strolling along quiet lanes arm in arm with the maidens of their choice, I was often amusing myself by roaming among the graves of the countryside ancestry, or by perching on the dilapidated rail fence that surrounded the neglected village burying ground, trying to visualize the portentous spectacle when all those tombs should burst asunder at the sound of Gabriel's trumpet, and the mouldering skeletons within them should stalk rustily forth to take their places at the bar of judgment. When thus employed, my morbid imagination would regale me with ghastly visions of doleful nodding skulls borne aloft by fleshless limbs that creaked timorously onward. Among my most valued possessions are several notebooks which contain much graveyard lore as well as all the epitaphs I have gleaned from a varied assortment of tombstones. Many of these stones were mottled with moss and lichen and crumbling with age, but I found them to be of even more absorbing interest than their modern neighbors, whose cold perfection was as yet unsullied. Delving for hidden treasure could not have fascinated me more than the deciphering of dim legends on the rigid faces of ancient, time-scarred memorials. When a lad, I enjoyed glibly reciting the most dismal of these productions to the horror or disgust of my hearers. One inscription of which I was then especially fond proclaimed the following mandatory reminder of our common fate. "Reflect, my friend, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me. From out the grave I speak today to you who now are on the way. To join the millions turned to dust. There's no escape, for die you must." These terse lines, repeated in sepulchral tones, never failed to grate upon the ears of my audience. As I grew older, my retinue of graveyards was extended by means of a motorcycle until there was none within 100 miles with which I was not familiar as with the cemetery in my immediate neighborhood. My fondness for the society of the dead weaned the living from me. One by one, even my closest relatives deserted me until finally only my mother tolerated me. They would suddenly think of some urgent errand that must be attended to at once if I was seen approaching. I would find the family living room emptied soon after I had entered it, and the loafers on the store porch would drift away simultaneously whenever I neared their rendezvous. At times I resented this, but usually it amused me. People had grown to dread my presence because I never neglected an opportunity of discoursing on death and the grave. "He has studied tombstones so much that he looks like one," once floated back to my ears from a retreating group, but I was undisturbed by such remarks. My father left a competence sufficient to provide each of his 3 children with a comfortable income. Therefore, I was free to devote my life to the peculiar pursuit that appealed to me. The death of my mother severed the last link that bound me to my childhood home, excepting the graves of my kindred. Strange as it may seem, these mounds were more attractive to me than many of those that rested beneath them had ever been when they were alive. After the death of my mother, my elder brother insisted that the homestead be sold and the proceeds divided. I then resolved to spend the remainder of my life visiting every graveyard I could find. Accordingly, I purchased a high-powered automobile, had it fitted with every convenience for comfort and safety, employed a callow youth who knew practically nothing but how to drive a car prudently, and started on my journey. A companion who was capable of asking pertinent questions or of being annoyed, as most normal persons are, by my odd characteristics and aim in life, was not desirable. We traveled deliberately. There was no need of haste, and I was determined to overlook no spot that harbored the bones of a departed member of the human race. Whenever such appeared, I left my man in the car and began investigations. Gloatingly, I threaded my way amidst myriads of graves. Some were dreary, sunken, and weed-grown. Others were beautifully rounded and covered with gay, nodding flowers, smilax, or graceful ferns. Occasionally I would find the grounds skillfully laid out with winding, flower-bordered walks and radiant with fanciful beds of coleus and geraniums, but most of the surroundings bore piteous evidence that the dead are soon forgotten. Ugly weeds filled the grounds, and long, strangling briar tentacle tripped the feet, scratched the hands, and tore the clothing of anyone whom ventured among them. Despite all obstacles, the most satisfying hours of my life were spent strolling leisurely among the tombs, reading the inscriptions on the stone and pondering on the futility of the struggle for wealth, fame, and all the other vain and fleeting things for which humanity contends. Almost a year had passed happily in this manner, and we were traveling through a delightful part of New England near the close of a glowing spring day when I espied a most attractive cemetery crowning a symmetrical elevation a short distance from the highway. An avenue lined with majestic trees led upward to the ornate iron gate that closed the entrance to the grounds. It was a beautiful scene that met my eyes as I loosened the latch and stepped inside the gate. The walks and drives were laid out with puritanical precision and paved with broad slabs of stone. Directly in front of the entrance, a large block of the finest white marble was mounted on a handsome granite base. Standing forth in bold relief upon the flawless surface were Gray's immortal words, "The paths of glory lead but to the grave." Never did that exquisite line appeal so vividly to me as when I stood there and gazed about me in that princely city of the dead. Stately monuments reared their glistening heads on every side, intermingled with many less lofty but no less faultless triumphs of the sculptor's art. It was plain that many dwellers in that peaceful haven of rest had trod the paths of glory to their ultimate destination. Illustrious names, famed in song and story, and familiar to every urchin in the land, gleamed forth upon those noble memorials. The air was vibrant with the song of birds and laden with the fragrance of the trailing arbutus, that sweet, modest flower so dear to the heart of the New Englander. Many of the shaded graves were carpeted with the clinging tendrils of these plants, and other artless flower faces peeped here and there among the greenery. There were no fallen tombstones, no broken, moss-grown slabs. All was neat and revealed the touch of skilled and loving hands. Passing slowly along, making notes in my memorandum book, and drinking in the beauty and sublimity with which I was surrounded, I finally came to the farther slope of the hill. Here the graves were few but not neglected, and I saw a small stone building, evidently a private vault. There were tiny grated windows on either side, and the structure was partly under the surface of the ground, it having been built into the side of the hill. A tall ventilator rose above the roof, and on approaching I was surprised to see a small chimney which had been hidden from view by the ventilator. I attempted to peer in at one of the little windows, but could discern nothing as the glass had been rendered opaque. I then passed around to the front of the structure. A stone slab served as a door. There was no sign of fastening on it except a hole that had been drilled through it, evidently for a cord to pass to the outside for the lifting of an inner latch. As I stood there regarding the building with curiosity, the door suddenly opened and an aged man appeared on the threshold. He startled me, as I had thought the place unoccupied, at least by the living. The man gazed at me with a look of extreme hostility and asked curtly, "Why are you spying at my home in this way?" "Home?" I echoed. "Surely you don't live here, do you?" "Indeed I do. Why shouldn't I?" "Well, you see, I thought this building a vault until I saw the chimney on it. After that I was puzzled and wondered what it was intended for, but it never occurred to me that it might be a dwelling." "When you have lived as long as I have, you will know better than to judge things by their appearance," was the cold reply. "Excuse me," I ventured. "I didn't mean to be rude. You've chosen a most beautiful environment in which to live." The stranger eyed me piercingly for an instant, then said, "Do you really mean that?" "Certainly I mean it. I envy you your neighbors. Most people are more afraid of dead men than of live ones, but I prefer the peaceful, unobtrusive dead every time." The old man's deep-set black eyes lighted with pleasure. "Ah!" he exclaimed, rubbing his hands together gleefully. "You're the man I've been looking for these many years. Sit here and chat with me." He indicated a bench beside the door. It was gratifying to meet this strange character. Feeling that his ideas might accord with my own and that we should find mutual enjoyment in each other's company, I was glad of the opportunity to talk with him. He was an intelligent-looking man of above-average height, well-proportioned with broad shoulders and long, sinewy arms. His hair and silken beard were long, but well-kept and of dazzling whiteness. He had the chastened expression of one who has suffered much and walked patiently within the shadow, and his broad brow was furrowed as by intense thought. Yet he had an air of contentment that a monarch might envy. We seated ourselves on the bench and conversed on topics of general interest. In response to his questions, I told him of my obsession and consequent journeyings. He was much interested, and when I finished he grasped my hand and exclaimed fervently, "Thank God that I have met you. No man has ever entered my home, but I want you to come inside with me. You will then be able more fully to understand what I am resolved to tell you. The story is not a pleasant one. When you have heard it, you will know why I live as I do and why I prefer dead neighbors." I followed my host into his dwelling. It contained only one room, but a curtain was drawn across one end, dividing it into two apartments. A small stove, a rude homemade table, one decrepit chair, a well-filled bookcase, and a stool completed the visible furnishings. We seated ourselves, and my companion began his story. I am what might be called a Southern Yankee. My father was a Confederate captain, and my mother a dyed-in-the-wool Yankee, whose parents disowned her when she eloped with a dashing young officer in gray. My twin brother Ronald and I were born in Alabama in the midst of the chaos following the Civil War, and our boyhood days were darkened by the fearful struggle for existence experienced by the people of the South at that time. You and I seem to have similar inclinations now, but I was quite young opposite when a lad, for a haunting fear of being buried alive made an abject coward of me. Consequently, I had no liking for graveyards or what was in them. I was subject to a sort of catalepsy, the exact nature of which was never determined. My parents thought the condition might have resulted from an injury inflicted upon me when an infant. At any rate, I had several attacks of more or less severity, during which I appeared to be dead. I could hear all that was said, but couldn't move a muscle. Usually I soon recovered, but on one occasion the authorities insisted that I be buried, as I had been pronounced dead by the physician and the coroner, but my mother refused to listen to them, declaring she would not believe me gone until she could see signs of decomposition. If she had lived a few years longer, the things I am about to relate to you would never have happened. My parents and I were reticent about my seizures. Even my brother was ignorant of their character, and the subject was painful to us. Naturally, I lived in constant dread of another attack, and you can imagine with what apprehension I watched my faithful mother growing older and frailer from year to year, for, aside from all else, she meant to me her demise might mean my premature burial. I had reached the age of 19 when mother passed away, and my father, who was devoted to her, followed her in less than a year. The old home seemed so desolate after our parents were gone that Ronald and I decided to dispose of it. We sold it and settled on a plantation in a thinly populated part of Georgia. The neighbors were few and far between, but we enjoyed the seclusion, and my health seemed improved by the change. I had taken treatment and hadn't had a cataleptic attack for several years. I had great hopes that I was cured or had outgrown the trouble entirely. Then the dreaded blow fell like a bolt from the blue. I was pronounced dead while in the throes of an attack of more severity than any previous one. The physician who was called knew nothing of my former attacks and declared me a victim of heart failure. Shortly after moving to our new home, Ronald and I had fallen in love with the attractive daughter of our nearest neighbor. She had found it difficult to decide which was which of us, as Ronald and I were identical in appearance, but love had found a way, and the girl we both loved had promised to be my wife. As soon as we became engaged, she had tried to discourage the attentions of my brother, in as kind a manner as she could, but I became the object of his most violent anger, and from that time on it was very hard for me to get along with him. Thus it was that our relations were rather strained at the time I was stricken, which was a month after my engagement. The horrible fate that had dogged my footsteps for so many years fell upon me when least expected. It is impossible for me to describe fully the anguish of mind I experienced while being prepared for and awaiting burial. If you have ever been in the paralyzing clutches of a nightmare and helplessly watched the approach of some awful doom, you may have a faint conception of the agony I passed through. Each hideous detail of my ghastly plight tortured me without mercy. I imagine the lowering of my body into the grave, the hollow thud of the clods that followed it. The smell of the dank, cold earth rose in my nostrils. I felt the creeping of the slimy worms that would soon rob me of human semblance. The ordeal of slow suffocation in abysmal darkness flaunted its horrors before me. Grim death leered and beckoned, and I knew there was no one that could save me. On that fatal morning I could hear the old Negro wench who acted as our housekeeper as she shuffled about crooning dismally, dusting and arranging the chairs in the seldom-used parlor where my coffin had been placed to await the funeral service which was to be held that afternoon. My brother came in several times and stood silently beside me. I felt that he was thinking he would now have clear sailing and could win my sweetheart, but I didn't think then that he was really glad I was dead. I couldn't believe that my own brother had reached that point in his hatred of me, but I was soon to know the worst. At Ronald's request, the few neighbors who had gathered at the news of my death returned to their homes, and our old servant left the house to go to the village for supplies. Ronald gave her permission to stay until evening, as her daughter who lived there was ill. Then he seated himself in a room adjoining the parlor, and everything became very quiet. God, how I prayed for power to move or to speak! Only a few hours remained before my burial would take place unless I could prevent it. After a time my brother came into the parlor again. As he did so, someone outside whistled sharply. The day was cool and stormy, and the windows were closed. Ronald crossed the room, apparently to look out, and said, "Go around to the side door." The side door opened into a small vestibule separated from the parlor by portieres. I could distinctly hear all that was said in the vestibule. Ronald entered it and opened the door to admit the caller. As soon as the man spoke, I knew him to be a laborer who had been helping us to clear land on our plantation. He was a rough specimen, part Indian with a strong trace of Negro blood. He had a brutal countenance and a silent, furtive manner. I had disliked to have him around, but my brother had insisted on hiring him as he was a good worker and strong as an ox. But at this time Ronald seemed impatient with the fellow. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly. "I just wanted to tell you all I done got that thing all fixed. He can't miss it, and—" "What are you telling me that for now?" My brother broke in angrily. "Don't you know he's dead already?" There was a moment of stunned silence. "Dead? You ain't foolin' me, be you, boss?" "Of course not, you fool. He died yesterday very suddenly. We won't go into that matter any farther. You cover that thing up and go on with the other work. Be sure you keep your mouth shut, too." The man cursed roundly. "Keep my mouth shut nothin'," he snapped out. "I done that 'ere dirty job for you. I mighty nigh fell in afore I got done. Now I wants my money, and I wants it damn quick. I done ripped my sister in Louisiany to get me a job, and I'd be in a Saturday. If you don't pay me off, I'll blow the hull's doin's." There was a menace in his savage tone as well as in the words, and Ronald hastened to pacify him. "Well, you go back to your cabin until after the funeral, and I'll pay you in time for you to start to your sister's place tomorrow," he answered brusquely. The sullen visitor departed, and my brother came back into the parlor, muttering angrily under his breath. He paused and stood at my side. How I longed to rise and strike him down. I knew then that he was not only glad I was dead, but was plotting to kill me when disease had laid me low and saved him from being my murderer. I could think of no reason for his treachery except that he was so determined to win my sweetheart for his wife that he was willing to take my life to accomplish it. As he turned to leave, his foot caught on one of the trestles that supported the coffin. It collapsed and fell to the floor with a crash. The coffin turned on its side, and, as the lid hadn't been fastened in place, I rolled out and lay face downward on the floor. I think the shock must have broken the awful spell that bound me. At any rate, I found I was able to move and could open my eyes. The devil of revenge rose within me. I resolved to make my resurrection as frightful to my brother as I could. He had an intense horror of the supernatural, and I knew his guilty conscience would help to terrify him. I recalled, too, that he had been unable to get his life insured because the companies regarded him as too great a risk on account of a weak heart. He had deliberately planned to kill me. Perhaps I could turn the tables on him. It was a wicked thought and unworthy of me. Ronald stood as if thunderstruck for an instant. Though I couldn't see him, I knew the accident had unnerved him. But soon he slowly approached me. I waited until he stooped to roll me back into the coffin. Then I suddenly whirled over and threw both arms around him. It was done so quickly and unexpectedly that he had no chance to escape or to recover his balance. He fell headlong, burying his face in my shoulder. He made frantic efforts to break my hold, but I gripped him like a vice. I was more muscular than he, and my thirst for revenge gave me a fiendish strength, while his fright made him as weak as a child. After a brief struggle, he raised his head and looked at me with eyes that bulged with terror. I could feel his heart pounding like a trip hammer. His face was ghastly, gray and drawn. I kept my features rigid, but had opened my eyes the merest trifle, and I returned his gaze with a dull, expressionless stare. As he looked at me, all hope seemed to die within him. His head sank down, a convulsive tremor passed over him, and he relaxed in my arms. I thought he had fainted, but when I rolled him to one side, felt his pulse, and noted the sagging jaw and glazed eyes, I knew I had succeeded in paying him in his own coin. I had killed him and left no mark. My first sensation was one of triumph. He had planned to get rid of me, but I had cheated the grave and beaten him at his own game. Then came a reaction, and I did a very foolish thing. Though there was nothing to prove I had caused his death, yet the fact that I had meant to do it made me fear I would be suspected. A guilty conscience needs no accuser is a true saying. I became terror-stricken and determined that no one should know that any change had taken place, if I could prevent it. I rushed to the doors and locked them. For the first time in my life I was glad to be a twin in the image of my brother. Tearing off my shroud, I rolled his body into the coffin and spread the garment over it, then folded his hands on his breast and combed his hair. Fastening the lid down securely, I pushed the coffin close to the wall. I couldn't lift it back upon the trestles alone, but I arranged everything else as it had been. Then I went to the buffet and took a drink of cordial. I began to feel very weak and feared my paleness might cause comment. I had regained my composure and was able to act naturally when a neighbor called a little later. I casually asked him to help me place the coffin on the trestles. Knowing that we had no undertaker, there being none available in many thinly settled parts of the South, he thought nothing strange of the request. The funeral occurred as planned, and my brother was buried. I assumed his name, and no one but my wife has ever known the truth until today. The next morning Ronald's accomplice showed me the trap he had been hired to prepare for me. There was an old quarry on our plantation which had been abandoned years before. It had become a dangerous pitfall into which stock sometimes fell and were killed. During the rainy season the seep water in it was very deep. In fact, a hunter had fallen into it a few years before we bought the plantation, and although his companions made strenuous efforts to rescue him, he was drowned and his body was never recovered. I was very fond of trapping and had caught many animals in the vicinity of the quarry, having gone to attend my traps so often that I had broken a well-defined path through the underbrush. It was in this path that a snare had been prepared for me. The quarry extended underground for quite a distance beyond the pit itself and beneath my path. It was at that point that an opening into it had been cunningly made and covered with the twigs and other debris with which the ground was strewn, so that it was impossible to detect its presence. If I had stepped on the light, trashy material that hid it, I should have broken through at once and been unable to save myself from falling to certain death at the bottom of the quarry. No one but the two conspirators would have ever known what became of me. The villain exhibited his work with pride, and after we had closed the opening to prevent accidents of the kind it was intended to cause, I paid the wretch the amount my brother had promised him, which I had found to be a tidy sum. He left the state, and I've never seen him since. I sold the plantation, and my wife and I went to Maryland. After a few years she died, and I came to this place. I bought this corner of the cemetery, erected this building, and have lived here ever since. I take care of these grounds for a reasonable stipend and the privilege of being let alone. I haven't had an attack of my malady for many years, but I'm not taking any chances of being buried alive, for I've arranged to be my own undertaker." The old man rose and lifted the curtain that divided the room. His act revealed a huge block of stone which had been hollowed out in the shape of a coffin. "You see, I sleep in this," he went on, "and after I lie down I lower the lid, which you notice is suspended near the ceiling. It has a secret lock on the underside which holds it against all comers. The opening left at the head isn't large enough to permit the removal of my body. The fastening of my door is entirely on the inside, so that when I draw in the cord no one can enter my home unless I wish, without breaking the door down, and that would be difficult. Even then my body cannot be taken out of this coffin, nor can the coffin itself be moved without expensive apparatus or the destruction of this building. I feel sure that no one will ever care to go to all that trouble for nothing. I have no relatives or friends, and no hoarded wealth. It is seldom that anyone comes to my door. Occasionally strangers stroll near, but after they get a glimpse of me they get away as fast as they can. You alone have shown a friendly interest or anything but repugnance. Most people act as if they think me a lunatic or some sort of a freak. Perhaps that isn't to be wondered at. I don't blame them for it. In fact, I prefer it, for they have no desire to disturb me. I rose, shook hands with my host, and thanked him warmly for the entertainment he had afforded me. "My friend," I said earnestly, "I envy you your security. You have gone to unusual lengths to protect yourself, and it surely seems that your plans must be successful. It is well worth the effort. I only wish that I was as well equipped to control the disposal of my body when I am through with it." And thus we parted. It was several years later that, on a dreary autumn day, I stood again at the iron gate of that New England cemetery. The leaves of the magnificent trees that border the avenue were falling in showers, torn from their moorings by a boisterous southeast wind that chilled me to the bone. I felt unaccountably depressed as the gate closed behind me. Gazing about in that silent enclosure, I knew that my hermit friend was either dead or unable to perform the task of caring for the grounds. While they were not really neglected, yet that exquisite neatness I had noticed on my former visit was absent. I hurried to the stone building, but the lichen-covered doorstep and the grass-grown path that led to it were sufficient proof that the owner was no more. Lingering about the deserted dwelling, I noticed that the small windows had been closed with mortar and stone. This aroused my curiosity, and I resolved to make inquiry concerning it if I could find anyone in the vicinity. I had passed a new residence on the highway shortly before entering the avenue that led to the cemetery gate, and I thought it likely that the present caretaker lived there. However, as I was leaving the grounds, I saw a man approaching carrying a rake and trowel. He appeared to be the person sought, so I saluted him and stated that, having had a slight acquaintance with the man who had occupied the stone house several years before, I should like to know what had become of him. "He died about 2 years ago under very peculiar circumstances," was the reply. "He was a strange character. I didn't know him and never saw him until after he died, but I shall not forget him. I only wish I could. It was thought he had been dead a week or more before anyone missed him. There was a lot of bad weather about that time, and no one happened to come to the cemetery for quite a while. I was a newcomer then and lived in the village. It happened that I was one of those who came out here to investigate when word came that it was thought something was wrong. We could get no response when we called to the man, and were unable to get into the house. It was impossible to see through the windows, so we broke one of them. A nauseating odor filled the air as the glass fell, and we saw a horrible sight. A large stone coffin stood along the opposite wall. It was mostly covered by a lid that fitted down inside the edge. There was an opening at one end of it, and we saw the discolored face of the old man lying in the coffin. His head appeared to be bolstered up and was turned toward the window so we could see it plainly. His features were contorted in a hideous manner. The mouth was distended, and the protruding tongue was terribly swollen and black. The glassy eyes were wide open and seemed about to burst. The expression of dumb agony in them was enough to curdle one's blood. Both arms were thrust out and upward, the bony fingers clutching a sort of framework at the head of the coffin. Some clothing that had evidently been hanging on the frame was scattered around in confusion. It was plain that the poor fellow had for some reason been unable to raise the lid and had struggled vainly to draw himself out through the opening at the head of the coffin. Caught like a rat in a trap, he had died of thirst and hunger, with food and water on a table almost within his reach. It must have been a fearful death. We closed the windows as you see them to keep morbid persons from flocking here to see the gruesome sight, and then left him undisturbed. From what we saw in the room, the old man had intended the building to serve as a tomb as well as a home. People that knew him say he was very eccentric, and I think he must have been. It certainly is odd for a man to prepare his own tomb and then spend years of his life in it, but I suppose he had a good reason for making such an unusual arrangement. It might not have been a bad plan either for a man who had renounced the world as he appeared to have done if the coffin lid had not become refractory and acted as a trap to bury him alive. End of section 1.